You too. Ah, we're working. Turn it on. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, welcome, of course, to GlobSec 2015. I have one slight request for you. In the building, we have major problems with interference from mobile devices. Those of you who've been to the theater before may know this. I'd like to ask you if it's possible if you could either classic turn off your mobiles and mobile devices or put them on airplane mode. Not silent mode, but airplane mode. Okay. If that's okay with you, okay. We can take some photos later and a few selfies, but during the actual event itself, it would be very good if you could do that for us, okay? Just, like I say, we have a few problems with interference, okay? Ještě po slovensky, či netreba? Ja neviem po slovensky. Okay, thanks very much. Thanks.
Which chair would you like? Good afternoon. Witajcie. Welcome, everyone, to the first of the GlobeSec City Talks, at least for today. My name is Kathleen Koch. I am an former American journalist from the United States. I worked for 18 years for cable news network, CNN. So you may have seen me in front of the White House or on Capitol Hill or in front of a plane crash or on the Gulf Coast reporting on Hurricane Katrina. And as a journalist, I find people's stories fascinating. And so I think we are really in for quite a treat here today because I have with me on my panel three of the most fascinating men from this corner of Europe to share their really unique and incredible stories that I think really reflect the dynamism, the energy, and the potential in this part of the world today. So I'm sure you all know them, but I will quickly run down the list. Sitting immediately next to me is Adam Schomlai-Fischer. He's co-founder of Prezi. And that's, if you haven't heard of it, a presentation product that is used by more than 55 million people on the planet today. Next to him, our host, Robert Vasch, without whom none of us would be here for this wonderful event. Founder of GlobeSec some 10 years ago today. So 10 years this week, I guess, celebrating its 10-year anniversary. And he is also president and CEO of the Central European Strategy Council. And then finally, last but not least, is Toomas Hendrik Ilves, president of the Republic of Estonia. So we are going to start this afternoon with Adam. Adam's got, being from Prezi, he has a presentation for you. So Adam, take it away.
Thank you so much. Can I please have my presentation? And I keep my time nicely. So, I'm from Prezi. It's a presentation software that I'm going to be using, so you're going to see what it is. And what I thought I'll talk to you about is our story of what we learned from growing and starting from this tiny town south of here called Budapest and making it to where we are today. And half of it will be what we learned in the US, and the second half will be, I think, something of an inspirational, motivational part for you that you can do the same if you would like to, with a lot of work. So basically, we have a very nice office in San Francisco and a very nice one in Budapest. And San Francisco is a great place because you learn so much there. Everybody is about great products, global success there. So that's just filled with knowledge. Budapest, my hometown, is something that's my personal place. That's my friends and family live. It's an emotional link. And it's the same for my co-founders. So we wanted to build a company that ties the two cities together and doesn't just move to the US, and that's it. A few words about where we are today, so you can position us. Of course, like anything else, it started in a small place. These are my co-founders, Peter, Halachi, and Arvai. Tiny room, working day and night. Of course, no money spent, no money made, but believing in a vision. And today, we are like 270 people from 27 countries in the two offices. And, of course, there's a lot of great people using our tool. It's used on TED a lot. My favorite one is in education. This was our first success. Around the globe, a lot of people, a lot of teachers and a lot of students started using it very early on. And we helped poor schools in the US, and we got a thank you from the President Obama, which was very nice. And we get a lot of good news out of this place of the world. We are very proud of that. There's not only bad news coming from our country. But this is not what I wanted to talk about, right? So this is just like blah, 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 the shameless plug. So what are the things that I learned during this journey? First of all, when you are in Silicon Valley, everybody, even if it's a bit ridiculous, if they have a coffee shop in the corner, they dream very big. They say, I'm going to be there, global, great. And even though this is a bit strange, you have to understand if you set your goals medium or low, you're never going to reach beyond them because you set up everything to reach that goal. Maybe it's Prezi, that's the same for us, like let's win the German market, and we do everything for that. But we are not aiming global, we won't really make it. The second thing I think is really interesting that And it was amazing for me traveling and living in many successful cities, is that the basic assumption is trust. If you have a new colleague, a new person you work with, you are assuming, oh, they're going to be so great. This is going to be great working together. Here we have a troubled past, a lot of non-functioning states, non-functioning societies. And our first impression is always like, maybe there's something fishy here, I don't know. And that really slows down the work. So we try to learn that how we build trust in our company. Then in Silicon Valley and in that part of the world, there's a lot of the companies are about their culture, about how they work together. The famous quote is, at Google, they have like this 20% free time. It's not really true. But, there's the idea that you develop a culture because a company is, in English, a company means like a set of people together. It's a nice thing. There's nothing evil about it. So you can create something great where people actually enjoy their time together. And in our case, for example, we don't have working hours because all the people we work with are grown-ups and they like our vision and they work as much as their work-life balance makes them and what they can manage. This is great. For example, in many countries, many companies in the Valley, and this is true for us too, we celebrate failure. If you break something, you can break a really big server. It's really damaging. What you do, you stand up and you say publicly that I broke this and this is what I learned. And people are going to applaud and be really happy for you. They're not going to blame you. And this is really important because if you cannot fail, you will not try. If you cannot fail, you will not push the boundaries. And we need every single one in our company to be really smart and try to do the really most important things, even if they can be risky. And the last thing which we really love is that it is actually quite common in the US for a company to stand behind the policy or have a vision about the society that they want to support. And in our case, we have a lot of charity projects, but one example is that, of course, we stand for diversity. We intentionally try to make our company very diverse in its nationalities. But for example, we started a movement with some companies to support the Pride movement in Hungary, which is not that popular. And we had this, it was actually working really well. We said that we are a company, and you can trust us because we make money, and we think Pride is good. So people started to believe it and join us in this movement, which I think is quite a nice thing. Now, so you might even have heard of these things like failure and vision. Now I'm going to tell you some things which I think are interesting. So I met this person. He's the mayor of San Francisco. We were in Mexico touring and promoting entrepreneurship. Of course, he was there because he's from San Francisco. I was there because we built a great company and I'm not American. And from Mexico's point of view, from the Mexicans' point of view, this was a great news that you don't have to be born American to grow a great company in Silicon Valley. So that was my position. But basically, he told me that 40% of the people living in that city are born overseas. 40%, right? Almost every second person you meet on the street. Here's one more thing. In 2009, we were a tiny company in Budapest, in a small town south of here. We got an email from the city of San Francisco trying to convince us to move there. A small company in a remote, tiny country, and from the capital of this industry. I think something would be the similar if Bratislava's council will decide that they look for tiny, interesting companies in the world and they try to convince them to come here. Why? Because San Francisco's role, even if it's taxpayers' money, it's not only to help all the American companies and the people there, but to create a strong business culture with the best people and the best ideas possible. So, if this is true, and if we went there, did we bring anything with us? Was it just like we go to San Francisco and bye-bye Europe? What I did, I asked some of our American employees who are from Silicon Valley or that region and they are US citizens, if there is anything impressive that they think is not typical to a US company, anything that they think it's something unique to us coming from this part of the world. And here are some examples. This person said that we are really transparent in how we make decisions. We explain everything, they can see through the whole thing. And her assumption was that this is because we have a troubled political past, we don't trust authority, so we want everybody to know everything. I think this is actually true, and it's great for a company. Second thing, this person loved that our feedback, when we give feedback to people, is really honest. It's not sugar-coated. It's not just trying to be nice every time. It's really valuable because of this. A lot of people said actually that they think that we are humble. Somehow our culture is not about me, I am the best in the world, but about us and do things together. And they actually love this. They have enough of that very individualistic standpoint. Again, we don't have policies, we just have a set of values that we really like. And because of this, there are not that many rules at our company, and some people think this is not so common there. By the way, these are our values. I'm not going to get into that now. I have 1.5 more minutes. And this is again interesting. We did Prezi, and we do Prezi because we really love helping people, how they share ideas. I've been presenting like this since a decade. I wrote it for myself originally. And when we started the company with my co-founders, we really set out that this is a great tool that helps people being more creative, more effective, how they communicate. And the company, the money, it's an essential tool to achieve this goal, but it's not the goal itself. And this is very sincere from me. And yes, a lot of American employees are very proud of this, that we are not like a bank, or I don't know, or a bad bank. Okay, I'm going to skip this. Now, so to my conclusion. Sorry, I will read it up because it's a bit burned out. So yes, starting from here, moving there, and staying here as well, we learned a lot. We had to learn a lot. There were so many things we didn't know. That city and that region is full of knowledge that we have to embrace and understand and grow. But we also brought things with us. It wasn't that we just went there and everything disappeared, that who we were. So I think it's actually quite a nice news to you. So when you talk to the global market, and I've been here, this was my position, like small company, somebody from here to the big global market, you have this kind of inferiority complex that, oh, they won't care, I don't know, I'm too small, I'm from here. But in reality, what happens is that if you say something interesting, wherever you go in the world, if it's an interesting product, people will listen and like it. One of our VCs, when we talked about investment, we talked for an hour about the ideas and everything, and then he asked, oh, by the way, where are you guys from? They didn't care. There were no presumptions that if you're from Eastern Europe, you must be not so good at this and that. And I think this is actually great news. So, we're a very successful species, society, as in humanity together. We massively impact this planet. And I would like to ask you to be smart and do global things so you have an impact on this work to keep its diversity, because I think that's going to be a much nicer future. And if there's one thing you can do to help me, I just want to ask you to convince the city council to invite a company from a remote place of this planet. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Adam. Lots of wonderful ideas for our discussion. Really impressive. President Ilvesen, do you mind if I call you Thomas? I'd like to go to you now to talk to us about your small country and how you have managed to become perhaps the most wired and technologically advanced nation on the face of the earth, that virtually anyone can now become an e-citizen of.
All right, I'll try to be brief. It's a long story, but I'll try to be brief. Basically, when we in Estonia was basically occupied by the Soviets and the Nazis and the Soviets, 50 years.
Occupation is a part of your history.
Yeah.
A long one.
But I mean, we reestablished our independence in 1991, and we had missed out on all of the infrastructure development of Western Europe. And you look at it, making new roads, bridges, and all that will take decades. And so it's pretty depressing. And I mean, at the technological level, we had a 1938 telephone exchange in the capital. I mean, this was, rotaries. You never always got the wrong connection. I was actually sitting in Washington at the time because I was the first ambassador after independence in Washington, and sort of going, what are we going to do? This is really bad. We were really poor, and the other thing that was sort of the motivational factor was that Finland, which is right across the bay from us, we were at the same level of development in 1939. There was a 13 times fold difference in GDP per capita between our two countries after these 50 years of occupation. So, and it's, I mean, we're not quite like, we're not as close to Hungarian, but Estonian and Finnish are very closely related languages. You could only part of the Soviet Union then, you could watch Western television, so everyone's sort of like, what are we going to do? And then a couple of things happened. One is that I had this little brainwave that we're actually, okay, it's going to take forever to build these roads, or whatever it is, ports. But one place we're in a level playing field. July 1993 was the first web browser. Mosaic came out. And we were like, well, I mean, it's new in the United States, it's new in Estonia. I mean, well, we're on a level playing field. We can do this. And we did have a lot of people who are really smart in tech already. So, well, that's one thing. Then I read this neo-Marxist, neo-Luddite book by Jeremy Rifkin called The End of Work, which is about how computerization is going to be terrible because everyone's going to lose their job. And he had this example there of a steel mill in Kentucky that employed 12,000 people and produced X million tons of steel. And then the Japanese bought it. This is back when the Japanese were buying everything. They completely automized the plant, and then they had 120 people producing the same amount of steel. And of course, he brought this as an example of how terrible all this is. But our anxiety in Estonia is we're so small. I mean, how can we compete? This is at a time when everyone's writing about economies of scale. There are a lot of companies that are bigger than my country. So it's but I said, this is great. We should computerize everything because then we can't. Our functional size can be much greater. So then I sort of started pushing the government at the time to basically computerize the schools. Because the other thing from my background is I learned to program at age 13. That was 48 years ago. I'm 61 now. But I mean, I had this crazy math teacher who taught us how to program. And so I said, well, you can learn that as a kid, and that's what the future is about. And so they actually listened to me, and they instituted a program to actually put schools online. And by 1997, all schools were online. The computer education was very good because, and there's a lot of opposition from the teachers because kids learn better, faster than adults. But I figured always 4 or 5% of the kids will go and try to figure something out themselves, which turned out 15 years later turned out to be true. But that was kind of the beginning and the backdrop to that. And the other lesson, which is important, I think, for everyone, is to avoid legacy technology. Because when we became independent, the Finns wanted to give us a 1979 telephone exchange. It was an analog exchange. The reason they wanted to give it to us for free was because they were going digital. And the government was going, yeah, well, let's do this. We get it for free. And I said, no.
Good for you.
Do not take
no
any.
secondhand here.
I mean, that was the lesson of World War I, actually, or the Versailles Treaty, where basically the Brits and the French stripped the German industrial plant, took it home, and they were still using, then they were using 1890s German technology in the 1940s and 50s. The Germans, of course, went and built everything new. So we didn't want to do that. And then slowly what happened is that people started getting into this, and we started having brighter and brighter kids. And then the thing that really worked was that there were 4 kids at the time who got together and, first of all, came up with a music file exchange program called Kazaa. And it was, and then after they were indicted by the FBI and were going to go to jail because they didn't like that in the U.S. Anyway, they got off, and then they invented something new, which was called Skype. And so suddenly 4 kids from Estonia, from this, Budapest it's a metropolis compared to Estonia. I mean, it's like, we're this tiny little backwater up there in northeastern Europe, and suddenly these kids, their product is all over the world. So that encouraged even more people to do stuff. That's sort of the beginning of it. The other thing we did was we realized that precisely because you can do a lot of things in IT that require fewer people, we started computerizing services. First thing we computerized actually was taxes. So we have, already in sort of the end of the 90s, people were doing their taxes online. You get the whole thing in front of you. You look at it, say if it's okay, you press a button, and
you file in 5 minutes. And Americans are so jealous.
Well, this is, And then we incentivized it. We said, well, if you file it online, you get your refund right away. And if you do it on paper, because we have to read it all, it'll take a long time. And so basically what's happened over time is that we've added more and more services online. And now basically, I mean, okay, Estonia, in fact, your most interactions between citizens and the government are done online. What I learned, and actually where I first heard of Prezi was I headed the European Commission task force on e-health. And I thought it would be all technology, and it turned out it was all legal. And this is one of the things that has to be understood if we're going to go for an e-country, is that you really have to make sure your legal frameworks are good. And that's a lot of the hard work has been done on that end. So for example, in my country, every citizen owns his or her own data, which is key to getting anything done. And then we also have a once-only law that means that the government may never ask you for any information it already has. But in order to
That's sweet, so you don't have to fill out a form every time you go to a government office.
Yes, well, no one goes
Endless
to government,
reams of paperwork.
You never have to do that. But in order to do that, then we realize you need a secure identity, which is where the problems come in, because countries are not willing to, or citizens are not willing to have a strong ID, which we have. And I mean, a couple of other countries have them, but it's a chip-based, two-factor thing where basically I argue that's the only way we can go in the future if you want to be secure. Anyway, so this has slowly been happening, and then what started happening then was because of this, people started doing all kinds of innovative stuff, also sort of in the civil society sector. So if you can go online, there's this movement called Let's Do It World.org, which was again, the guys from Skype invented an app to take pictures of garbage and giving the location of it. And then what we had was this cleanup campaign. And people would, and then we had a logistics company also do the software for the logistics. And now this thing is taking place in 99 countries in the world. And we just give the app away, and it's just used, and people who want to clean up their country use this.
Amazing.
We now take the system that we have developed for the data exchange, and that is our foreign aid. Because we just give it to countries. We say, here's the operating system. You want to build it up, build it out, do what you want to do with it, whatever, you can do it, but here's the software to do it. It's open source, non-proprietary software. So
and why not sell it?
Well, first of all, the government bought it. So the government owns it. So, I mean, it bought it in the sense that it did a tender and a bunch of software engineers developed it. And, well, so it's there. And so, I mean, it's easier. We've already bought it once. So now we can give it away to, Moldova. We gave it to Moldova. Moldova's implemented it and works great. Some other countries you give it to, it's not so great, but we can give it away. So anyway, so what's happened now is that Estonia is Estonia, and for example, right now I'm co-chairing the World Bank's first ever report on IT and development. You'd think they'd get around to it a long time ago, but they're only doing it now. But it's because they looked at countries, and I guess this is the final list. They looked at countries, who's doing really well, who's really advanced. It was Estonia, Finland, and Singapore. But they said, but the difference between is that Singapore and Finland began doing this when they were rich. We started doing this when we were poor. And so there must be something in there that we did right to get to where we are. And we're always happy to have people come and look at what we do, and we're happy to give away our software, or at least the operating system, and you can do what you want with it. I wish I should have done a Prezi presentation here. It would have worked much better. I'll work on it.
And then the citizenship aspect, right? That's one of the newest
residency.
items.
It's not citizenship.
Residency, okay, residency. An e-resident, not e-citizen.
Yeah, the difference is that we can vote online, and we do, and basically 34% of the population votes online. But residency, you can't. Citizenship, you vote. Residency, you can use the various services. So, we have a digital signature, which you can sign anything. These are not really. These are things that actually are completely. There's nothing new or anything. It's just that they're not implemented. There's an EID directive in Europe that allows you to have digital legal signature that is legally valid across Europe, but you just can't do it in most countries. I mean, that's the problem. But I mean, but the laws at least are there for that. So you can sign legal documents, and well, I mean, you can do all kinds of things. But there are all kinds of services that you have in this sense that, excuse me, that we have, and we would like to see the rest of Europe have. For example, we have digital prescriptions. 99.999% of prescriptions in Estonia, you go to a doctor, he puts in a computer, and you can go to any pharmacy in the country, stick in your card, put in your code, and you get your prescription. Now, the sort of logical no-brainer would be that, well, Finland has this too, sort of. I mean, not for everybody, but why don't you do it so that if you come to Estonia, you get sick, you lost your prescription, you go to an Estonian pharmacy, but you're already in Finland for having penicillin or something, and then you pick it up, and then the ultimate logical step would be that throughout the European Union, I mean, if you are visiting, if I'm in Bratislava and I suddenly sort of need something, I call my doctor and he goes, okay, I put it in the computer. You go to the pharmacy in Bratislava, stick in your card, put in your number, and you get your thing. And then you can move on to thinking about all kinds of other services, health records, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's certainly where I would like to see the European Union go. I just think it's going to take a long, long time.
And how many e-residents do you have now?
I don't know where we are. I guess 12,000. I mean, it's not. We just started this thing, so
That's
it's not.
exciting. I sat actually at dinner last night next to the very first e-resident, the
Lucas,
journalist,
yeah.
Ed Lucas, right. He was on a panel of mine last year here at GlobeSec, and he pulled out the card. He said, look, I'm an e-resident of Estonia.
Well, he also
He's
likes
very
that
proud.
he's 0.00001. It's just anyway.
So, speaking of GlobeSec, let's move to you, Robert. I just think the story of GlobeSec is astonishing because 10 years ago, you were 21, and you and a group of other students, 4 or 5 of you, said, hey, let's do this thing. Audience of 100, 150 or so. And now here you are today with perhaps the preeminent, the most respected security conference in this region. Tell us how you got there, and I mean, did you ever even imagine 10 years ago that this is where you'd be?
No, and how we got here. Well, the short version is that I woke up, invented GlobeSec, and did it. But that's not true.
Sounds so easy.
It is a little bit more difficult. First of all, what you have to have is a free society. If you don't have a free society, you can't have individual projects you can build on. And we take the values of democracy, freedom, and all the values that the Euro-Atlantic community is built up on as granted, but they are not. And we see it today in Ukraine with the tensions with Russia, etc. Our parents had to fight for these values, and you need also individuals who can take advantage of those values. We live today in a very cynical world where everything is bad. The government is bad, Americans are bad, Brussels is bad, Russians are bad, Hungarians, everybody. So we are living in a very, very cynical world. But in 25 years, there are very inspirational stories. Estonia, a great country which made it to the forefront of a digital age. From a small country to be one of the first ones to digitalize almost everything which is possible. Inspirational story from Hungary with Prezi, going global from a small Central European city. We have Slovak stories like ESET, which has gotten global, Sajik, and many others. And I started when I was 21 with a conference. I was studying international relations in Banská Bystrica, and it was 2004 when we joined EU and NATO, and at that time my country was in a mood, okay, we made it, we are in, relax, we got it. that's the end. Now, we did not agree with that because being part of NATO and EU is not the goal, it's just a tool. And if you don't use that tool, you know, you don't transform it to opportunities. So we wanted to show something before we end our university, that Slovakia is not only just a small country, but we can influence things. And there were a lot of inspirational stories from similar countries as Denmark, Belgium, etc., which are very successful in international scene. So as students, we came up with the idea that we want to bring a world debate to Bratislava. And especially here it is very difficult because Slovakia was always part of something. It was a part of Austro-Hungarian monarchy, then it was part of Czechoslovakia, then it was part of something else. And we always were, okay, so they will decide and we'll adapt. And when we wanted to transform this thinking that actually we want to come up with solutions on the international scene and not just wait for what is coming here from Brussels, from Washington and Berlin, but let's be at the table and let's discuss and decide how Europe should look like. So
You
this
wanted
was
to
the
lead
original
instead of
idea.
follow.
Sorry?
You wanted to lead instead of follow.
Exactly. And the past of this region was that we were always on the periphery. We were more objects of international policy than subjects. So first of all, we wanted to be at the table. And all the solutions which were made in the international scene were discussed in Brussels. And we wanted to put Bratislava on the map of European and global thinking. We didn't know after first year that we will be, whether we will be successful. We wanted to just start off our careers. But after the first year, when we were successful, we decided that we'll put everything into that. We didn't have money, we didn't have telephone, we didn't have a bank account. We just put our spare money that we earned during some works and invested into that project. We didn't know whether it will succeed. But after first, second, and third year, we've seen that it is possible. And today we are an organization of 36 full staff employees. We are doing 60 projects in 18 countries. And today's conference was just covered in American media, in British media, and it was a worldwide covered conference. So actually from a small country in a small city, you can influence the world debate on very important issues that are going on. And it means that the size of a country is not the main condition whether you will succeed, but is the intellectual capacity that you are able to produce, even in a small city like Bratislava. But first of all, the main issue is that failure is the key to success. You need to be prepared to fail. If you are not prepared to fail, you will not succeed. Because after 10 years, the success of GlobSec looks like a linear success. Growth every year, a better conference, but we had a lot of bumps at the road. And
Lots of people along the way probably said, "This, you can't do this. You're
yeah,
crazy, right?"
And our idea is if we reach some level, we need to push it even further. And it is always harder and harder, but always easier in a sense because you have a brand. And if you build up a brand, you can work with it. And the credibility of brand is very important. But being 21 years old in an international diplomatic community, which is very traditional and very conservative, based on the age and seniority, it was very tough for a 21-year student to persuade your partners that you're able to do something which is worth following.
How did you get them to take you seriously?
Well, I was sending emails instead of meeting.
Ah.
Didn't know who is behind. No. But I've seen the faces in the first 2 or 3 years of GlobSec when I was welcoming somebody and they were asking me, "Where's the boss?" That's me. So they seen the young face behind, and many of them were surprised.
Well, Robert, I have to confess, when I met you and Milan Solar, this was 2 years ago at the Halifax International Security Forum in Canada, it was an old friend of mine, Kurt Volker, who brought them up and introduced them to me. And you said, you know, we like the way you moderate. We would like you to come to Slovakia to our our conference and moderate for us. And I was thinking, these young college interns, they have a security forum at their university, whatever. I said, send me the information, I'll look at it. But I had no idea. And then when you sent the information, I'd never heard of GlobSec before. Yeah. And I investigated, and I was quite impressed.
No,
quite taken aback.
We were investing a lot of into the branding, into the innovation and technologies. We use a special app for the conference. We have a GlobSec TV, a special GlobSec Daily today. We have invested a lot into trailers, etc. So from the beginning, you have to have global ambitions, because if you don't have a global ambitions, if you set your goals too low, you stay too low. That's a problem. But also, managing expectations is very important, because you have to build up a group of people who are believing in your idea. And if you are picturing that idea, which is too far, by you persuade them you can reach it, and you don't reach it, it is very disappointing for everyone. And there are a lot of people who are then demotivated not to continue, and there are a lot of them. So the most important thing is to keep the motivation high, whatever happens, and whatever problem and bumps come into the road. Because if you're unable to go through them, you're unable to continue.
Thomas, I'd like to bring you in, and Adam as well. Your thoughts when I hear these stories. It sounds like all three of you have succeeded enormously against all odds. And obviously there were probably, as I was mentioning to Robert, plenty of people who said, you're crazy, this won't work. Plenty of times you considered quitting. So is there something special in the DNA in this part of the world that gives you this optimism, this will, this determination to persevere?
Well, I always get really annoyed at East European defeatism, and we can't do anything. We have blah, blah. I mean, this kind of, why bother? Everyone is bigger. We're too small. Exactly. We're too poor. Yeah. No one will listen to us. And
so your history is an albatross around your neck, then.
Right, and I just don't. That's a broad, general sort of attitude that I think is. It's just you have to overcome that, and I mean, what I described took about 20 years, and I mean, for the first 5, everyone was trashing this idea, and then when it started happening, then about after a year, was saying, well, it died, it didn't work, and just keep doing it and keep doing it.
Did you have personal doubts along the way that it would work?
No, I had no doubts whatsoever. It was the only thing was that whether it would find the acceptance in the public that would go with it, and trying to figure out how to do it. I've been always convinced that this is the way to go, and the society is going that way.
Adam?
Yeah, you can actually get motivated by this constant complaining, because it's so annoying that you just want to prove yourself. Like, no, this is not true. Come on, let's work very hard for a decade. And then people then believe you and they listen. Actually, one of my co-founders, Peter Arve, he's half Swedish. And when we were discussing that he joins and we start together the company, his uncle was driving him to the airport, and he was complaining all along the way. Peter had a very nice job in New York, and it wasn't easy for us to convince that he joins. But because of that, he got so annoyed of his uncle. He was like, "No, I'm gonna prove you wrong. This is stupid. You can't live like this." We can build from this.
But actually, my biggest motivation when it comes to the real source was that during university I was really using my time into putting everything into a youth NGO, Euro-Atlantic Center, and 3 years we made a lot of seminars, a lot of gatherings. We had Slovak politicians at university, etc., and I was quite proud of that. And then my friends, who were always going to the beer, came to me. Robert, you're always playing on something. What is this you're doing? Just do something which will be visible. And I was like, right? 3 years I'm investing into something, and somebody tells me that is nothing, and it so motivated me. So then I went home and wanted to prove that there are people who are capable of doing something. So complaining is a motivation.
It's so interesting because I find that in the United States too, but I wonder what it is that makes the difference in the person who hears the criticism, hears people saying you can't do it, and then gets discouraged and quits, and the person like the three of you who hears the criticism, the naysayers, and says, and it steals your determination to keep going. What is that?
Well, you do get the press at times. I mean,
Okay.
I'll be honest.
We're getting real and honest here.
So, but I mean, I think there is what I would call sort of East European, Central European learned helplessness, which is this sort of paradigm in behavioral psychology, which was discovered by a guy named Martin Seligman 45 years ago, where if you get these uncontrollable shocks to dogs and they realize they can't do anything about it, and so they just give up. And so he developed this model of depression based on this thing that when dogs, and then later he had developed this for people, that if you're in a situation where nothing you do makes any difference, which is actually, I would say, was the condition of people under communism for 40, 50 years, which is that if you try to do something new, try to do something that isn't approved by the Central Committee, you will just be slapped down. And there are only accepted ways of doing things, and that is going through the party, going through the Komsomol, whatever, that people sort of gave up. And so there is this feeling that, I mean, it's not just my country. I see it. I go to so many countries where there's feeling, oh, there's no point. I mean, it's changed dramatically in my country, too. Now there's this whole thriving startup scene, and people are trying to do stuff, and it's all very different. But in the 90s, there was so much of this sort of defeatism that why bother? I mean, you know, they are going to get us anyway. They will invade us anyway, or they're going to stop us from doing it anyway.
Why try? That's so interesting. I mean, your country has more startups per capita, correct, than any other country on the face of the planet.
We have a lot.
So that's what. That's
yeah,
what's
no, that's
written
what. Yeah,
anyway.
I mean, there are a lot of very successful startups that are. I mean, we have things like TransferWise, which is we're doing all money transfers in Europe completely differently, and it's much cheaper. All kinds. I mean, there are all kinds of things, but it comes out of this. I would argue two things. One is a change in attitude, and the other one is that we have all kinds of people who have, after 15 years of educational sort of opportunities in IT, means that I mean, educational reforms take 15 years usually, minimum 15, 20 years. So now we're bearing the fruit of kids who 10 years ago or 15 years ago got to go into a classroom and play with a computer and then decided they're going to become software engineers.
What do you think, Adam, in this region's success as these countries move forward? How important will this entrepreneurial spirit, startups, be?
I think it's really key. A lot of people don't know that actually most jobs are created by new and small companies, not the big companies. And the public opinion is always supporting, oh, let's get a deal with that giant company, and they created 200 jobs, yes. And the government, and they got bribed, and you know. So I think this is really key. But I'm even more excited about the cultural impact, because when you meet people who had experienced personally that their own work had an impact on their life, that they did something and it actually changed something in their lives, then they share this story and they tell others, and then others get motivated. And we intentionally invest a lot of money into Hungarian PR. We don't have a business in Hungary. We don't make any money there. And the sole purpose is just to like tell these stories that you know, you can actually do it today. And yes, our parents have opened the way for us. Yes, it is very clear that they were not allowed even to do private businesses. But this is really key. And I have one more good news for us, I think, that actually I remember now when I changed and I believe that I can do a lot of big things. So I traveled a lot. I used to be an artist, and it went better and better, and I was still a bit cynical and like, I don't know. But then I saw that anywhere in the world, is this very hard-working minority who brings about change and who does the great things. This is the same in the US, same in Japan. This is, yes, some things are easier, some things are harder, but if this is true, then you can be that hard-working minority here. You don't have to start by changing everybody right away. And then slowly, yes, it can take a decade, but slowly things will change. And I don't know, I just felt this is great, because if it's only about my hard work, I can probably do it.
I think there's an interesting thread running through these stories, and you addressed it specifically in your presentation, Adam, about the focus not being on making money. And so often in society, and certainly in the United States today, that's the goal, the big job, the big bank account, the big house, a million cars, the pool, all that. And it's interesting that sociologists, people who study what brings workers true happiness in their jobs, true contentment, it's not money.
No.
It's actually the knowledge that you're making a difference.
Mhm.
That you're making a difference. Talk about that and your experiences with that.
We were people of doers and not complainers. So you just need to get things done, not to wait for a change and not to wait for the opportunity. I have many friends who are complaining, who will give me the opportunity? I'm waiting for the best opportunity. If you want to wait, you will get old. Create the opportunity. And that's the key. We have a society and democracy and freedom where we can do the change and we can do a lot. Not to wait for somebody changing your life. You have to do it. And I think small countries can do it.
Thomas?
Well, I don't know, I guess my whole life I've been dealing with things that are not possible, sort of people telling you don't
You
bother.
specialize in it.
Well, I worked, I was an analyst at Radio Free Europe in the 80s, and I remember I was told by the director that, yeah, you're really smart, but your country will never become independent, so there's no point. Why don't you work on this other topic? Because you
Wow.
write well, but let's be honest, we know this will never change. So don't, and I said, no. So I mean, it's been like that all along.
Now, I didn't ask you, Robert, before we started, are we taking audience questions?
I guess so.
Do we have a microphone? I don't even know if we are set up. We are, because I didn't want us to run out of time before we go to the audience. So why don't we take a moment now, any of you who would like to, and raise your hand and identify yourself. Please, microphone, we have a question right here. Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Hello, is it working? No, yes?
I think it's
Yes.
on now.
Yeah, okay, thank you. My name is Anna, I'm Ukrainian. I would like to ask a question to Mr. Isles. I've been to Estonia in 2013, and I always, when traveling, I enjoy talking to people. And what I've learned from older generation of your country, that as any small country of the European Union, you suffer a bit from the that youth leaves your country looking for better opportunities elsewhere. And my question is, with all this IT development, how do you manage to keep youth in your country, for example, in comparison to other Baltic countries? And how are you successful with attraction of foreigners who would develop startups in IT in Estonia? Thank you.
Well, compared to the other Baltic countries, we certainly have a much lower rate of emigration than, let's say, Latvia and Lithuania, but that is due to factors that are completely different. It's just that we had Finland, so we had people, and Estonian and Finnish are very funny languages, but we understand each other. And so people went to Finland in the 90s, and then they sort of realized it's not El Dorado, even though it's one of the richest countries. And so people do go abroad. But much more important than this is something which is a political decision where we need really Europe to do something. And I'll tell you a true story, which is that since I'm always trying to, there's young people do interesting things, I invite them for tea or coffee. And I read the story about this 24-year-old kid who had gotten $300,000 for a startup. And so I invited him to coffee, and he said, well, yeah, he told me what he was doing. He had this great idea and, for engineering software. And he said, but, Mr. President, I'm sorry to tell you, I'm leaving in 2 weeks, and I'm moving to the United States. Okay, well, what happened? I mean, he went to the United States, and in 6 months, he had raised $4.6 million. Last October, after he'd been away for 3 years, he sold his company for $100 million.
Wow.
So this is a story repeated over and over again throughout Europe. Why do these people go there? They go there because 2 reasons. One is because the US market is 330 million. The European Union is 500 million people, but we do not have a digital single market. It is easier to take a bottle of wine from the Algarve in southern Portugal, ship it up to north of the Arctic Circle in Lapland than it is for you, for a Slovak to buy an iTunes record for a friend, for a Bratislavan to buy one for a friend in Vienna. You can't do it. Because we don't have a single market. And one of the key in digital services, unless we get a digital single market in Europe with a market of 500 million, we will see our people leave. I told my story to Neelie Kroes, who was in charge of digitization Europe at the Commission. Then the Commission, now there's a new person who happens to be Estonian. But anyway, she told me that, yes, I had the same thing. I was in Portugal, and I went to a government-funded incubator with 45 startups. And every single one told me, that as soon as I get my startup capital, I'm moving to the United States. So this is, when I said, I was saying that often it's the legal environment that determines whether you can or cannot do things. We live in a continent, we live in a European Union in which the largest market possible is 80 million. It's Germany. And countries like Hungary, Slovakia, mine, it is not possible to have a successful startup with lots and lots of people because if it's a service-oriented thing, it's not going to work. So this is a political thing that we have to push, and you have to push, is to get a digital single market. And this is one of these things people say, oh, the European Union is all bureaucracy. Yes, it is. But if you want to create a digital single market, and if we want to compete with 330 million in the United States, and we want to compete with 1.3 billion in China, then where Alibaba is this IT company that's like the biggest in the world, then we have to make big changes in Europe. And that way people will stay here because they think, well, if I do this thing in Europe, I'm not going to have to go away. I don't have to go to the United States.
You create jobs
Right.
here, you bring money
Right.
here, you don't have this terrible brain drain.
Right. So this brain drain of, especially in IT, of people going to Silicon Valley or going to Route 128 in Boston, it's terrible. It really is but that's, how can you blame them? That's where the opportunities are. So if you have we see this all throughout Europe. It's no more or less true in my country than it is in Germany. A lot of Germans, the richest people, move to the United States because they see they can't do anything. They can't do it here. You probably have similar experiences.
This was exactly our line of thought. We did open our US office right away. We started. We kept this one because we wanted to do something good here, but it would have been probably easier just to have it there. And this was, we just did the numbers. That's a huge single culture market, more or less. It's just impossible. Even if we do something great, somebody copies us half a year later in the US, they can outgrow us in a few months.
Yeah. Well, our guys all basically keep their developers in my country, but their offices are there.
Okay, another question. I thought I saw another hand right down here, lady in the red dress.
Good afternoon. My name is Magda. I have 2 questions. One question to Mr. President. I visited your country 13 years ago, and that was the start of the voting process through internet. And I remember there was a fantastic atmosphere, and everybody thought that that will be 50, 60% of the population voting on internet. And as you've mentioned, there is today 35%. What's the matter behind it? That also in your country there is not possible to overcome 50% of internet voting. There is something as a burden or something so. For Robert and Adam, and there was really nobody from the elder generation behind your startups. You were really alone. Yes.
Yes, this is an easy answer.
This
yes.
is my question of the probably oldest here. Yes. Thank you very much.
I think I'm the oldest.
So do you want to take on the voting question?
I'm 61. Okay, I'll just quickly, I mean, it looks like 35, 33% is the, right now, it was the first, it increased every election, and then it has leveled off for the last 3 elections at 33 to 35. You know, a lot of people have a thing about voting, going to the voting booth and voting. I mean, it's, the people who use this tend to be, well, I mean, we've now done studies, and it's left to right, it's evenly distributed, old to young to old, it's evenly distributed. But some people just like to go and, you know, do the thing of going to vote, because, I mean, I vote online. It actually is not very romantic. You just, you know, you log in and you press the thing, and it's like you're done. Whereas people, I mean, people like to go to the polling station. It's like they're feeling a part of the process. And I understand that. So, I mean, right now we're, you know, as I said, we're doing 33, 35, election to election, and, well, but it does have other things that advantages. So, for example, you can vote anywhere in the world. I mean, one time I actually voted online simply because I was on a visit to another country and I had to vote. Well, okay. And it means that you can, your citizens abroad can participate much more easily, because if you're like living in the United States, for example, and you're not living where there's a consulate, we only have 3, I mean, so you can't really, so, I mean, you're not going to, I know a friend of mine who's the former CEO of Skype voted online in Palo Alto, and he was being visited by a Finn who said, only way I can vote is driving 450 miles down to the consul in LA. So he didn't get the vote in his election, we get the vote. So, I mean, it's,
More questions?
no, there.
Okay, Adam, did you want?
8.
No, I mean,
Oh, she said no.
I think short answers are good, no?
Okay. Okay, more questions here?
I will answer that
Okay,
as well,
go ahead.
because that went to me, I think, as well.
Okay.
And my answer is a little bit more complicated. Behind the idea, there was nobody. This was a true student project from Banska Bystrica. But as you know, when you need to develop a startup, you need to start to fundraise. You need to start to look for people and partners whom you can group around your idea, because you're unable to push that through in such a complicated world as diplomatic world is. And we needed to start to look for right persons who will be able to help us in develop the idea. So the first was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and you were the State Secretary, whom we persuaded that you need to provide us with the premises of the MFA for the first GlobSec. So I remember that very well. And our discussions were very inspirational at that time. Later on, I have persuaded Ambassador Rastislav Káčer to join our board as a president. And there were many others who joined later. But that's about building a trusted organization. You can't do it alone because you're not the expert for everything. You can have a great idea, you can motivate people, but then you need a larger group of allies who will be fighting towards your idea. So this is really a big, big endeavor with around 70 partners that we have today build up around GlobSec. They are coming from a lot of European countries, from United States, etc. So, but to persuade people at the beginning, it was extremely, extremely hard. But also it was hard for some of those who have invested money into us, because it was risky as well. Because those who invested time and energy into us at the beginning, they couldn't know whether we will grow it into something that is worth in a few years. So they were brave enough as well.
Let me say one thing I would say also is that one of the benefits of getting old is wisdom. And one of the things that I learned as a former young person, always younger than all of the other people around me, and always having to fight because they would say, "Oh, you don't know." I mean, my life has consisted of doing things where I'm the youngest, and they look at me and they go, "What?" That was so frustrating. That now I sort of see that, and when I see young people doing stuff, I want to support them so they don't go through this thing that I went through, where, I was, by 20 years, I was the youngest person at Radio Free Europe doing what I was doing, and you don't know anything, and it was so frustrating that I don't want to do that to other people who are young, and I never want to use age as a way to hit people on the head, preventing them from doing what they should be doing.
Okay. So, more questions? Let's see, do we have anyone else here? Okay, right here, another one. You absolutely may.
I also have one question to Mr. President, because recently Janika Merilo from Estonia, Janika Merilo, I don't know if I pronounce it properly, she came to Ukraine sharing her experience in development of electronic government system, and I would like to ask, are there any other countries which you are helping in such a generous way to develop similar system in their countries?
Oh, there are lots. In fact, we have an e-governance academy that's had people from over 80 countries come to study what we do. Went and done things in the Palestinian Authority, in Moldova, in Tunisia, most clearly. On the other hand, we were visited by the Minister of Government for the United Kingdom, Francis Maud, who was very skeptical, and he visited us, and he was there for 3 days, and then he said, "Why don't you send us someone, second someone to my office for a month or two?" And 10 months later, he was still there. He did come back, but I mean, so it's not simply that we're going around to developing countries and assisting them. I mean, also countries more developed than we are. Or another example, which was that Finland was going to actually buy for 600 million euros a proprietary closed source operating system to manage their healthcare, and then they realized that in fact we have an open source, non-proprietary software that you can modify all you want and works better. And so Finland, which is, far richer than we are, opted for our system because it was cheaper and better. So, I mean, it's in IT. This is, I guess, the one lesson in IT is that for me, which is why I keep talking about it, is that it doesn't matter. You don't have to be the richest country in the world in order to do something neat, innovative, and cool that then is taken up by other people. So yes, we do go around to all kinds of places, invite people to come with us, and we also actually offer now up till now the sole master's degree in e-governance, which is really a combined degree in IT. I mean, learning to, code and do all that stuff, and then a master's in public administration, because the big revolution that is yet to happen in this world is that we still live in a serial paper world, where papers go from one place to a second place, and each place you get, and especially in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you get a stamp on it, and then it goes to the next office, whereas all of this is possible instantaneously, virtually, if you do it in parallel and using the right kind of operating system.
Gentlemen, I'd like to thank you all for sharing your inspiring stories today. And I'd like you to just briefly, when you look at the future of this region, what most inspires you? Do you see any central storyline emerging as we look at the future? Robert?
Central storyline, only one. I think there will be a lot of stories, but what I would wish for is that our region will not be on the periphery anymore. We want to be the drivers of the European and transatlantic agenda, not to be just followers. So I think that should be the storyline. Try to be the first, 1 or 2 steps ahead. Don't wait for solutions from the Western capitals. Let's put them on the table. Let's try to do everything for that.
Adam?
I hope the future global citizen, its culture, her and his culture, will be a little bit more humble and a little bit more collectivistic than if he don't succeed.
Think about the we versus the me. Thomas?
Well, I mean, I think that we have to get over our sort of our feelings of inferiority and inadequacy because we're small or because, you know, we came later to the game than others. And there will always be people who will exploit that, just as there are people who exploit their age against young people. There are countries that will say, well, you're tiny, what can you do? Oh, you don't really, you don't really get it because we're, an old democracy. There's a lot of that. In fact,
But you can be the mouse that roared, right?
Well, well, sometimes I feel like we're the Grand Duchy of Fenwick in my country, but it's. But I mean, the point is that there are a lot of people who have been doing something a certain way for decades and centuries, and really don't think that they have anything to learn from other people, which means it's just more of a battle. But I think if you have a good idea, if your idea is better, you will ultimately win. But it means it's not easy. It's not going to be easy getting a digital single market where people don't really understand computers. So that means you have to keep pushing and you have to work harder at it.
Thomas, Robert, Adam, thank you all so much. And I want to conclude with an interesting quote I found online, actually from one of your professors in Stockholm at the Royal Institute of Technology, who said something, and I hope this quote is correct because I found it very inspirational. It is not your job to solve problems that people give you. You can build visions. So don't ask for problems because they will become your limit. So thank you for joining us. Go out there and build some visions. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You've either just come in now or you were here for the last debate. Is that right? Oh, you have season tickets. Okay. Okay. Right. If you weren't here before, could I ask you during the debate if you could turn off your mobile devices, please? We have major turn off or put on airplane mode. We have major interference problems. Okay. If that's okay with you. So if you want to take any super photos of me or the rest of the crew, now is the time. But during the debate, on airplane mode, if you can, or switched off, or silent regime. So, okay, thanks very much.
thank you very much for turning out
For
for
me,
this
it's possible to
very
do without
important
gin, but it's better with.
event. I'm very pleased to welcome here Timothy Snyder and here Professor Andrei Zubov. We're going to spend the next hour on a subject which I think we could all spend at least a year and possibly a 3-year university course studying. World War II, are we doomed to repeat the same mistakes? But we're going to try and cram this into an hour, at least do the highlights. I think certainly in this part of the world you don't need any explanation at all about the importance of World War II, the destruction it brought, the circumstances that gave rise to it, and the legacy that it left. And I also suspect that in this part of the world we don't need to do very much introduction to my panelists, Timothy Snyder, author of the definitive book Bloodlands, which I gave the longest review that The Economist has ever printed of any book ever when it came out. Professor Zubov's History of Russia in the 20th Century is, I think, one of the most important books published since the collapse of communism. It's 2 volumes. If you don't speak Russian, you should learn Russian, but if you haven't got time to learn Russian...
But this book has just translated into Czech language.
It's in translated Czech, fantastic.
Yes, and the second volume was published, I suppose, a week ago. The second volume.
Fantastic.
The first one was published in autumn.
Well, this is very very good news, and I'm trying to ensure that we get the book also published in English. So what I thought we would do is, first of all, I'm going to ask you to turn your phones off, because I don't want to hear your ringtones, beautiful though they may be. I'm going to ask our 2 panelists to give just very brief thoughts on, not their definitive thoughts, but just some brief thoughts on the way in which the post-World War II settlement broke down, the situation we now face, lessons from history, but really just in the sort of very summary form. And then we'll get into a discussion, and I shall be bringing you in to ask questions. When the time comes, please introduce yourself and wait for the microphone to come so that we can hear you. I am going to keep my phone to hand because I use it as a watch. So that doesn't mean that you can't, if you have phones, please put them away, because one of the great things that Tim has done at Yale is he's banned his students from having laptops and other electronic devices in the lectures, which I think is a brilliant idea, because it's so dispiriting when you're on a panel giving a talk and all you see is a sea of Dell and MacBook and iPads and this sort of stuff. So please put your electronic devices away. You don't need to tweet this. Concentrate on what we're going to hear. And on that note, Andrei, why don't you kick us off? Give us 2 or 3 minutes of the lessons of World War II and whether we're doomed to repeat them.
Thank you. When I thought about our session, our meeting, I think it's necessary to say some words why the Second War started and how was the organization of the world immediately after the war. So it's 2 different questions. Now, of course, both of us are nervous, thinking about the possibility of new war in Europe. In this Globek conference just 2 hours ago, we spoke about the possibility of war. It's a terrible thing. And now I speak about this. But I hope that in the second part of our session we speak also about the regulation, the right regulation of the world after the war or during the war. It's also necessary. But world made some mistakes. The first mistake was the regulation of the of the world after the First World War. This Versailles system. It was a system of annexions and contributions. And many people, though Germans and Austrians, felt themselves in a very poor position after the end of the First World War. And it was in this mistake was some elements of the new war and some elements which allowed Hitler to took something, to search something in the hearts of German people to go to power, to reach the power. Another mistake is the principle that peace ought to be defended by all means. Just this principle resulted in Munich decisions of 1938. This attitude, this approach resulted in strange war which Great Britain and France had with Germany in 1939 and in the beginning of 1940 before aggression of Hitler Germany against France. This mistake resulted in Soviet Union supposed not to be aggressor when he started his war against Poland in the 17th of September, 2 weeks and a half later than Germany. The third mistake states which won the First World War, they took on territories and contributions, but they did not penetrate into the political system of Germany. And that's why revanchist ideas could flourish again in Germany. After the Second World War, situation was absolutely different. No annexations in the eastern part of Europe, but denazification, democratization, demilitarization, and decartelization of Germany, this 4D principle. And the fourth and the last mistake of the First World War and the period between First and the Second World War, that Germany was not included into not totally included into the world of the victorious nations. It continued to be the nations of the second value. And that's why also Nazism could flourish in Germany. After the Second World War, situation was absolutely different because this Marshall Plan for Western Germany, for Italy, helped them. They were unified into the organization of steel and color, and later to the European, to the United Europe. And this approach was successful. I think that today, when we see United Europe, when we see European Union, for us, for historians, for me, I speak about me, of course, it's a miracle. It was impossible. We know the previous centuries of European history. We know these wars of the 17th, 18th, and the 19th century, and of course, two terrible wars of the 20th century. And now it's a miracle that we have united Europe. And it is because of the victorious nations understood their mistakes which were made in Versailles system and in 30s. And I think that now when we see reality, probable reality of the new conflict, military conflict in Europe, not only in Ukraine but wider in Europe, we ought to think about these mistakes of the past and think about good, right solutions after the Second World War in the western part of Europe to organize the future European peace, future European consensus. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed for kicking us off with those very thought-provoking points. I particularly like your 4Ds, which was one of the 4 points had 4Ds inside it, and that was particularly good. But Tim, you've written that the European order now hangs in Ukraine in the same way as it hung in Czechoslovakia in the 1930s. Some people say that there's a danger of making historical analogies too precise, and that history may rhyme, but it doesn't actually repeat itself. Expand on a little bit on what you said. Is Ukraine really Czechoslovakia?
Well, first of all, Ed, I want to thank you for taking part in this, and above all, thank Professor Zuboff, who has been one of the people who has made analogies, I think, an effective part of the historical discussion, and who has spoken his mind about possible analogies from a position which I take to be not only admirable but also courageous. Now, what I would say about the relationship between the history and the present is that although, of course, history does not repeat itself, history is always a factor in at least a couple of different ways. The first thing is that people draw lessons from history, whether we like it or not, and those lessons are present all the time in the minds of our leaders. We can't avoid that, and even if you and I don't make analogies, Chancellor Merkel or President Putin or President Obama are going to make analogies, and we're going to have to talk about those analogies. Secondly, and more seriously, I agree fundamentally with the gist of Professor Zuboff's remarks. There are some lessons of the 20th century that even though the 21st century is very much not the same, we can nevertheless try to remember what those lessons were and then check to see if they apply. It's no good forgetting all the lessons of the past on the logic that they might not apply perfectly. Sure, they don't apply perfectly. Some might not apply at all. But the idea that we should therefore just forget the past completely, right, I find to be, let's put it this way, mistaken. So let me just suggest 3 ways, very briefly, in which thinking seriously about the Second World War might help us think more seriously about the present conflict. The first thing is to remember the Second World War from the perspective of the Soviet Union. I would say that nothing has been more mythicized in the last couple of years than that, but there are a couple of very simple things about the Second World War from the perspective of Moscow that if we were to remember them, or if even people in Moscow were to remember them, might improve the level of debate. One of them has to do with the West. Moscow starts the Second World War with an effort to destroy the European order, that is, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is an effort to destroy the European order in the precise sense that it's an alliance with Hitler meant to drive Germany to make war against France and Britain, on the understanding that this would bring the bourgeois capitalist order to its knees and eventually to crumble. So the question would be, for the present, is that really such a good idea? The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was the beginning of the Second World War, the most destructive war in the history of the world, in which the absolute majority of the victims were citizens of the Soviet Union, right? So the question might be, is trying to destroy the Western order really such a good idea? And that's a question which we can raise at a time when Russia's foreign policy, as they never cease to remind us, is to weaken and eventually, I think, to destroy the Western order. The second thing about the Second World War from the perspective of Moscow, which I think is really interesting, is just precisely that it was a world war, okay? So the Red Army defeated the Wehrmacht, barely. The Red Army defeated the Wehrmacht, barely. If it had been a two-front war, that is, if the Soviet Union had had to fight a two-front war against Germany and Japan, would the Red Army have actually won the war? This is something that in all the commemoration of the Second World War, we're not really asked to remember. But for the Soviet Union, the important thing was that it wasn't a world war. The Americans were fighting the Japanese. The Americans defeated the Japanese in the Pacific. And not only that, the Americans were using the Pacific Ocean to ship all kinds of technology and equipment to the Red Army, which the Red Army was then using to win the war in the West. Now, I might have missed it, but in the commemorations of the Second World War on Red Square, I don't remember that they were commemorating all the Jeeps and all the Studebakers and all the American technology, which they were actually using to fight their encirclement battles against the Germans. Now, I don't make this point to say rah, rah, America. Rah, rah, America, something I rarely say. I make this point to show that if you remember the history, it can help you from it can prevent you from hurting yourself with myth. Because if, again, you think about current Russian foreign policy along these particular lines, what Russian foreign policy is doing is alienating the United States, cutting itself off from Western technology, right? So here you might see a general lesson if you were to look for it. No one now is reminding the Russian population that the Soviet army won the Second World War thanks to Western technology. And the reason for that, of course, is that sanctions are restricting Russia's ability to get Western technology. So remembering the history of the things that you're trying to mythicize can be very helpful. Likewise, if we look at the Second World War from the perspective of Ukraine, we can also see a couple of useful things which might help refresh the debate. To amplify a bit a point that Professor Zubov made, Ukraine has been at the axis of European systems for a very long time. Germany won the First World War on the Eastern Front and tried to use Ukraine to feed its soldiers and its civilians in 1918. In the Second World War, Germany's object, Germany's main war aim was precisely Ukraine. It was Ukraine that was occupied for much of the war. More Ukrainian civilians died than Russian civilians during the Second World War. All of Ukraine was occupied, although only about 5% of Russia was occupied during the Second World War. And the whole idea was to turn Ukraine into a granary, into a source of food for Germany that would allow Germany to transform its economy and to become a world power, and so on. That is something which is worth remembering, not just because it makes the Germans feel guilty, although that's always a reasonable objective, but because if one remembers that Ukraine has been at the axis of major European systemic competition for a very long time, for a whole century, it can help you see that it might be at the axis of a major systemic competition today, which it in fact is. And then here I'll just echo the closing remarks of Professor Zubov. The EU is not just a miracle. I agree that it is, but it's not just a miracle. It's also an institution. And if one sees it from the Ukrainian point of view, one can understand why people would want to join an institution which would get them out of, for lack of a better word, the colonial position. One can also understand the Russian aspiration to destroy the European Union, because that is what, of course, would lead to a relatively better power position for Russia. So there's my introduction.
Thanks very much indeed for that. And I'm going to go straight back to Professor Zubov, because you've raised a very interesting question of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which I think is in a way, is the sort of defining political and historical action of the last century. Without that, as you've written in Bloodlands, we wouldn't have had the majority of European Jews being put into the jaws of the Nazi killing machine. But it's fascinating to me how the historiography in Russia towards the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact has changed. We had a period of when it was the protocols were secret, then they were published, it was acknowledged, they were revoked and denounced, and then we've seen it kind of creeping back in more and more explicit form, most recently with President Putin, who seems to wobble between saying, yeah, it wasn't great, but sometimes in tough times you have to make tough decisions, but sometimes goes towards a more Soviet view, which is this was an entirely justifiable response to the failure of the Western countries to join the Soviet Union in standing up to fascism. So how do you see it from your point of view, this discussion of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in Russia?
Wonderful question. You see, today in Russia, we have discussion not on the Second World War, not on the, for example, aid of the Western countries to the Soviet Union. The plot of historical discussion is what was the communist regime in itself? Was it part of Russian history and only in different forms continue a Russian history? Or if this communist regime was something absolutely different to Russian history and was in conflict position with Russia during these 7 decades. And that's why I approach to war. If this Second World War was the only one of the wars for increasing the Russian Empire, and in this way, Mr. Stalin was only the person who continued a policy of, for example, Catherine the Great, Peter the Great, and some other Russian emperors, all he follow absolutely different example. And I always try to explain that by two reasons. One reason in inner policy and one in international policy, it is absolutely different period of Russian history. It's not a continuation of our history. First one, it was cruel in the home history. It was cruel attitude to our domestic population. Many millions, many billions of people were killed, persecuted. All our traditional values, our church, and all other fields of our living, our social groups, our peasantry, Cossacks, were destroyed totally by this regime. So this regime was against Russia, not a continuation of Russia. And another moment, international politics. From the 17th century, from the beginning of the Romanovs dynasty, and even in Middle Ages also, but we will speak about this period after the 17th century, Russia always was in some coalition with other European powers, with one power against another powers. All our wars were the wars of coalition. Russia never was against Europe as itself. It was, for example, in the First World War, you remember very well that Russia was in the alliance with Entente Cordiale, yes, with France and Great Britain. And after, when the communist regime occurred in Russia, it was against Europe, against all the world. It was in close connection with only totalitarian regimes, as Nazi regime after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939. And now, again, we see Russia in very complicated attitudes toward its own population. And as, for example, as some enemy against the West, So I think that main approach of today's Russian historians, of official approach of Russian historians, says that we are different civilization. Russia is different civilization. One civilization is Western and other Russian civilization. It's a total mistake if we look into the previous centuries of Russian history. Of course, Russia is not another civilization. And, but today we continue Cold War politics. We continue Comintern politics of first communist leaders after the October Revolution. And that's why our politicians want to speak about different values, different civilization, different interests, and struggle with Western world. But it's a terrible mistake, as to me.
Thank you very much for that, and I'm sure we'll come back to these points in the discussion. And I just want to turn back to Tim, not with my Germanophile hat on particularly, and I'm sure there are other Germans in the audience who will want to push back much harder. But there's a very common sort of, maybe very simplistic idea, which I think is particularly well-rooted in Germany, which sees what happened to Russia after 1991 as being a kind of Versailles cum Brest-Litovsk, a very humiliating and unfair historical settlement. That Russia, the new Russia, was excluded from the European security order, and that we have now reaped, just as we reaped the harvest in 1939 of what we sowed in 1918, now we're reaping the harvest in 2015 of what we got wrong in 1991. That, I would think, very many people in Europe would basically think that's right. Why is it wrong?
Well, a couple things here are worth contemplating. The first is the nature of the Soviet Union itself. I mean, I would agree with Professor Zubov, although I might mention another aspect. The Soviet Union was not Russia in that it defined itself as not Russia. It defined itself as a communist state, which constitutionally was a federation of units with national names, of which Russia was only one. It did not proclaim itself to be Russia. And when the Soviet Union came to an end, it fell apart along the lines of the borders which had been established inside the Soviet Union. This is important because the claim 25 years later on that the West did something to Russia in 1991 cannot make any sense because there was no Russia to do anything to in 1991. Insofar as the West was doing something to anyone, or rather with anyone at that point, it was with the Soviet Union. And the slippage between Russia and the Soviet Union, just to take a slight detour, is very important, especially in the German debate. Because if you say Soviet and mean Russian, or say Russian and mean Soviet, not only are you unintentionally accepting one school of history and not another, you're also confusing important issues of history. Because of course, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, it was invading the Soviet Union. And the first territories it reached were Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Eastern Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, and then and only then, Russia. So it's very important to keep these two terms distinct for a lot of reasons. But the second thing I wanted to say is that not only could the West not have been doing anything to Russia, since there was no Russia in 1991 as a sovereign state, what the West's policy was, and Berlin and Washington were very similar in this respect in 1991, was to try to hold the Soviet Union together. President Bush, as you will all, well, actually, as I look at your age, you do not remember this, although you're nodding.
Their parents will have
You're
told
nodding.
them.
It's very nice that you nod. As you will all pretend to have remembered, in 1990, the President of the United States went to Kiev and gave an impassioned speech about how Ukraine should not leave the Soviet Union because the American investment was precisely in the reform of the entire Soviet Union. The United States was not acting to take the Soviet Union apart, it was acting to hold the Soviet Union together. So there's a deep illusion which we have to worry about and contend with, and that is the idea that whatever happens, it's because the West wanted it to happen, or what's worse, because the Americans wanted it to happen. The Americans were trying to hold Yugoslavia together. That didn't work out very well. They were trying to hold the Soviet Union together. That also didn't work out very well. So I think just a tiny dose of historical context is enough to remind us of some basic things. Not to mention, and this is probably what you wanted for the answer, Ed, but not to mention that after 1991, Russia was invited in a whole series of ways into Western structures. And Russia's distance from Western structures today is not a matter of what those Western structures are, so much as certain choices that Russia itself chooses to make. In 2012, Russia was much closer to NATO and the European Union than it is today. NATO and the European Union have not changed in those intervening 2 years, but I would venture to say that Russia has.
Both parts of your answer were excellent. Thank you very much. But the first one, I think, is an extremely important point. And many times during the Cold War, I remember working at the BBC trying to avoid the conflation of Soviet and Russian. And people would say this is just pedantry. And I would say it's not pedantry, it's principle. And here we are. Now, I'd be very happy to take some points from the audience. And I noticed a very dear German friend of mine wincing in the front row. So you're very welcome, Uli, if you wanted to, make a point. Anybody else as well, please. I can't see anything from here, but perhaps I can do if I put my hands up. So please stick your hands up if you'd like to say anything. There are microphones, and we'll be very happy to take some questions from the floor. You don't have to be a professional historian. You don't have to be a student of history. It would help if you've read a history book. That may inform your questions, but all points are welcome. Who wants to be first? Yes, go ahead, Uli. The microphone's coming.
Spot on me. I'm a professional historian.
Yes.
I have a PhD in history.
That disqualifies you, actually.
Hand over the microphone. Maybe I'm too old also to ask a question, but I will try. I mean, I think there's an analogy that we see often in Russia today between Germany and Russia, and it has been, you have talked a little bit about it, but it's the idea of victimhood, I think, which is seen as a parallel between Weimar Germany and you also kind of refer to it and Russia today. But I think, I mean, this belongs rather into the basket of analogies that really, I mean, distort history rather than explain anything, because Russia hasn't been, I mean, there has been no war. I mean, I don't understand really how you, from today's perspective, can see 1991 as a defeat. But I think this is very much the discourse, or at least partly the discourse that we have among Russian elites today, seeing 1991 as a defeat and a starting point of humiliation. So what is the question? Question is this perhaps goes to Professor Zuboff. Is this really, I mean, the narrative today? Is it new humiliation, 1991? And what emerges, what kind of perspective emerges from this? Thank you.
Go ahead.
May I answer?
Yes, please.
Yes, it's really a good question. Of course, in 1918, we saw the total victory of Entente countries against Germany, over Germany. And nothing like this we see in 1991. But for a strict historical point of view, it's absolutely different things. But for mass consciousness, it's rather close. I published a large article and delivered a lecture a year ago, which I named Versailles syndrome in today's Russia. You see, Belovezhsky syndrome. You remember that in Belovezh, in Belarusia, three presidents, Yeltsin, Shushkevich, and Kravchuk, signed this decision to dissolve Soviet Union. And people, not only in Russia, but many people in other parts of the former Soviet Union, they understood this as a terrible loss. They lost their country. They lost their country. Not all, of course, of them, but many. And first decade, maybe first 15 years of post-communist Russia were the years of very difficult life. And really, people think that Russia was not a center, one of the centers of power, as it was Soviet Union, as it had been Soviet Union before. And that's why this sense of national humiliation, national humility was very strong among Russian people in Russian Federation. And Mr. Putin understood it very well. And when it was the decline of his popularity in Russia in 2011, 2012, he decided, I suppose, absolutely rationally. It was not irrational reaction, it was a rational reaction. Maybe somebody of his advisors told him about this. Use this weapon. I remember that in the beginning of the 19th century, Metternich said to Austrian Emperor Franz that people's consciousness is the strongest weapon in your empire, and you ought to use it just as you use army. And Putin used this national consciousness of humility.
Humiliation.
Humiliation, yes. because, I'm sorry, yes, because Crimea in itself means nothing, nothing. Russia has a lot of territory, a lot of population. Crimea is a problematic territory. A lot of Russians went to rest, to spend their vacations in Crimea, and, for example, me also, before this annexation. So no problems at all. But the idea of restoration of empire was very strong in Russian consciousness, maybe subconsciousness. For example, I remember today these figures were given in our session in Globek conference, that it is absolutely right figures. I know it very well from our social investigations in Russia, that only 30% of respondents, Russian respondents, suppose that it was before annexation of Crimea, it was in 2012, that only 27% of respondents suppose that today's borders of Russia are the best borders for Russia. Some of them suppose Ukraine ought to be in Russia, some Belarus, and approximately 1/3 supposed all the Soviet Union, including Baltic states, ought to be in Russia. So with such a subconsciousness, of course, the idea of re-emergence of empire had very strong support. And at this moment, see to Hitler's politics, absolutely the same. German people were disunited after the Versailles, so I unify them again. I unify them, Danzig, Memel, Austria, Sudetenland, and all other lands. So I think that it is a real historical analogy. These two events are very close, but results are different. Right. Results are different because Hitler used to be prosperous victor. He made one victory after another without any drop of blood before bloodlands began. I mean, this Anschluss of Austria, nobody was killed. Anschluss of Memel-Gebiet, nobody was killed. You see, and German people think, oh, wonderful. Even invasion into Poland, as it was given by German propaganda, it was almost bloodless. Of course, it was not bloodless in reality. But with Mr. Putin, everything turned to be much worse. War in Ukraine turned to be difficult, bloody, very expensive, and with no victory at all. So I suppose that Mr. Putin lost his war just in some months after he started it. Maybe in autumn of last year, maybe in the February of this year, but he lost his war. So this analogy finished in this moment.
Okay, so
go ahead, Tim. Yes.
Just two very quick little points, since it wasn't to me, but I think they're important. The first is that even if and when victimhood, a sense of victimhood, is related to a historical event, it can very easily transcend that event and become something entirely subjective. So if we take the case of Germany in the interwar period, to be sure there's some sense of humiliation with lost territory, but what Hitler is talking about is not chiefly Versailles and the loss of territory. As time goes on, and especially as war goes on, he's chiefly talking about Germany as the victim of an international conspiracy led by Jews. And it's very important to observe and to watch out for this slippage, because what I worry about in Russian history, not so much that of historians, that's a different debate, but the historical myths that are being propagated now, my concern is that Russian history is being presented more and more as virtuous Russia constantly surrounded by an international conspiracy, which has no other objective except to humiliate poor Russia. So once you slip from being a victim of one event to being a perpetual victim, then you've slipped into conspiracy thinking. And once you've slipped into conspiracy thinking, you will always think that you are right and everyone else is wrong. The second little point I wanted to make has to do with the future of Germany, because of course Germany did find a way out of all of this, and the way out that Germany found was not the Second World War, but the aftermath, European integration. And what European integration is for Germany, as for everyone else in Europe, it's a place to go after your very real empires or after your imperial dreams collapse. There is a problem of empire. I agree with Professor Zubov that it has to be hard to be Russian after 1991. But it was also hard to be Spanish or Portuguese or Dutch or British or French after they lost their empires. Essentially, every major European nation has gone through this story in one way or another. The real question is, what do you do after empire? European integration is one answer to that question.
Wonderful. I absolutely agree with these two remarks.
I'm struggling to inject a note of controversy here because my two friends who I both admire very much are agreeing very. But that's great. The discussion has been flying past.
But there are not two histories. There's only one history.
That's right. That's right.
But I think is that Thomas over there. Yes. Go ahead. Introduce yourself, please.
So I'm a Lithuanian working in Estonia at the Defense Think Tank, and I'm a war studies scholar. So when we study war, and World War II is one of the study objects, and it was a total war. And we also looked into the nature of regimes involved in this struggle. And when you look at it, at least two of the regimes' belligerents were totalitarian regimes. So the nature of regimes. That's why one of the reasons the war was total, in essence, at least for Germany and the Soviet Union. Now, fast forward, and if you try to sort of look into contemporary Russia, at least to me, I'm not a historian, but I look at the regime in Russia, it's a KGB clique at the heart of the regime. It's tantamount to Gestapo taking over and running West Germany from 1955 onwards, to me. Now, to you as historians, and I know that probably the line between authoritarian and totalitarian is somewhat of a slippery or blurred, I don't know. But when you look at the present-day regime of Russia, do you as historians already raise red flags that it's sort of slipping into a totalitarian nature or character of the regime? Or is it still sort of an authoritarian, kind of, obsessed with, of course, the interest, the humiliation, and so on, but it's not totalitarian yet. But we're perhaps moving in that direction. I don't know.
Thank you very much for that question. And are there any others? I might take one more before we move into the final round of... yes, go ahead, in the front row, Sam.
Borja Laceras from the European Council on Foreign Relations. To Professor Snyder, how successful do you think this historical revisionism has been in terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which President Putin nowadays claims is actually a peace treaty, and it was an attempt to weaken Germany? How successful do you think this strategy is going, and particularly in the west of Europe? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So we've got the question of authoritarianism slipping into totalitarianism and how far that is. I think your analogy of it's as if West Germany was taken over by ex-Gestapo people is very powerful. It'd be even more powerful if you said ex-Gestapo people and their criminal associates. Because I think the overlap between this sort of Czechism and criminality and the sort of institutionalization of corruption is one of the most troubling and corrosive things that we've seen. I think I'm going to throw in one other question, which is about what do we mean when we talk about the weaponization of history? At The Economist, we don't like it when people turn nouns into verbs, or for that matter, verbs into nouns. So I would prefer to say using history as a weapon. But we talk about this just like we talk about information being weaponized. And to me, what happens is you twist history so that you take all the credit. Your country takes all the credit and is always virtuous, and you avoid all the blame, so nothing you did was wrong. And then you use that to try and confuse your opponents and make them feel that they're guilty, and to kind of stoke up support among your own people, which is incidentally very much the way the kind of jihadist single narrative of perpetual victimization of Muslims by outsiders works. So that would be I'd throw that in. But let's go to you first of all, Professor Zuboff, on either the questions from the floor about Molotov-Ribbentrop and extremism and totalitarianism, or my point of weaponization.
If we speak about authoritarian or totalitarian regime, so I may do an experiment by myself. I will return to Moscow in a week, and if I is arrested immediately, it's totalitarian regime. If I'll be allowed to reach my home, it will be authoritarian one. If we speak about analogy about Gestapo and KGB, yes, of course, it's the plot of our problem, because after the Second World War, in West Germany, and even in the East one, but in different forms, it was organized very deep denazification. And you maybe know very well that even in West Germany, it were some recidives of Nazi feelings in the end of 50s, in the end of 60s. You remember this anti-Semitic activity in the 1959, 1960 in Köln and other places in Western Germany. But systematic denazification produced its effect. And now Germany is conventional European country without strong Nazi feelings. Though I ought to say that approximately 6 or 8% of German population express some views with some sympathy to Nazi regime. But it's normal. These deviations are in all countries. And in your republic, in Slovakia, in Czechia, in Poland, the systematic decommunization took place after 1990. It was not easy process. Many people say that something is wrong with this decommunization, but it was absolutely necessary to do so. And if decommunization was not done in your countries, you will have just such a regime here as we have in Russia. You see that even after a quarter a century of decommunization, yes, you have here in Central Europe some nationalistic, some rather authoritarian mood, political activity. You see it. I prefer not to call names. But in Russia, and Belarus, in Ukraine, in all other parts of the former Soviet Union except Baltic states, we had no systematic decommunization, no decommunization at all. In Belarus, for example, they began to use a flag of independent Belarus of 1918 and then changed it to Soviet flag, yes? And Soviet coat of arms, for example. In our Russia, in Russian Federation, Mr. Putin immediately, when he returned to power, he changed our anthem to Stalinist one, from very fine music of Glinka. And it's a tendency. And now, just now, in Moscow, people discuss to rebuild monument of Dzerzhinsky, or not to do so. And they want to organize some referendum. And I'm not sure that majority will be against it. So the main problem now is systematic decommunization. But the main problem why it was not done in Russia is because we had no alternative elite, non-communist elite in Russia in the beginning of 90s. You here in Central Europe, you had this elite. For example, Václav Havel is a wonderful representative of alternative elite, or Mazowiecki or Valencia in Poland, yes? But we had not. Only some persons like Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov with no circle around them. So nobody, it's a tragedy of Russia. It's a tragedy of Russia. After the Second World War, many Germans returned to Germany, for example, and some of them, Konrad Adenauer, even never left Germany. And Thomas Mann returned. But what we speak about Russia? So now, I think, it's the best time in Russia for systematic decommunization, since in this quarter of century, new generation grew. And we have young people and people of the middle age who started to understand that it's a different way to future except communist way. And that's why Mr. Putin is for prolongation of Soviet system of mentality. I name his regime fascist in plot, but packed in communist paper. Because it's not ideological, it's strictly scientific attitude. Since we have private ownership, it's not communist, it's private ownership, but it's communist ideology. So it's some mixture. We like to speak about hybrid wars, but it's a hybrid regime. You see, fascist and communist. And the young generation of Russian people, many young intellectuals who study in Prague, in Berlin, in Paris, they return to Russia, they want another Russia. Maybe only just now we have a possibility to change life for conventional European life. And some our opposition parties, for example, Yabloko, of Mr. Yavlinsky Palnasov, former Prime Minister Mr. Kasyanov, they try to organize our life in this direction. Yeah. Of course, it's very difficult.
Thank you very much. I love this idea that we are getting at least the critical mass of a potential alternative Russian elite. I think the problem is they're mainly living in Tallinn, Riga, Warsaw, Prague, London, New York, and these other places. And this is the great difference in the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union's restrictions on travel turned it into a kind of pressure cooker. And what Putin has done is cleverly kept the safety valve open so that people go abroad. But anyway, in the remaining minutes...
I'm sorry, Timothy, that I spoke so much.
Oh, no worries. It's a pleasure.
Yes, steal your time.
No. It's quite all right. It's quite all right. It's a pleasure to listen to you. These were really good questions. Let me try briefly to do them justice. On the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, more than a year ago, in Kiev, I predicted that President Putin would rehabilitate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And when I made that prediction, my rationale was that he is already cooperating with the European far right in a way which is impossible to miss. And the logic of cooperating with the European far right is to destroy the European order. That's the same logic as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I think that's one of the reasons why it has been rehabilitated. But I think there's a more fundamental reason, and that is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is the most straightforward example of cynical great power politics that one could imagine. I mean, one can't imagine two regimes that presented themselves more differently, nevertheless coming to a common accord. So what the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact represents, ironically, is the same thing that Munich represents for Mr. Putin, and that is an era when men were men and states were states, and they destroyed the states that weren't really run by the real men. Something like that. An order of so-called great power politics. And I think one of his great disappointments has been that there are so many men in European politics who turn out to be women, in either a figurative or a literal sense of the word, right? So Chancellor Merkel is one of the great, as you like, statespeople who understands that a Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is a kind of feature of male nostalgia as opposed to a real possibility for Europe. But I think the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact has been rehabilitated as a kind of historical challenge. And to answer your question, there are far too many Europeans who do not remember A, that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is what began the Second World War, and their whole project of integration is supposed to be against the Second World War, and B, that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a logical product of an era of the 1920s and 1930s when there was no European integration. It shows what happens if you follow the populist argument that the European nation state is okay. If Europe, God forbid, was to fall apart into nation states, these are the kinds of alignments which would then follow. Europeans like to think that they're extremely nice and therefore they would do nothing to each other under any circumstances. Historians tend to take a more skeptical view on the Europeans as nice question, on the Europeans being nice question, and tend to think rather that you have extremely good institutions and that you ought not to toss those institutions away. In effect, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact rehabilitation is an invitation for Europeans to toss away your institutions and to go back into a world of great power politics, which would be a disaster for you, and frankly also a disaster for Russia. On the second question of totalitarianism, I don't want to go into this at great length, but one way in which I think the regime in Russia is like a totalitarian regime is in the Hannah Arendtian sense of not accepting the reality of an outside world. So the outside world is only there as a kind of source of stimuli for a domestic propaganda story. The outside world has no reality which can be separated from the way in which it is a source for domestic propaganda. As I mentioned earlier, this is one of the things that worries me the most about Russian history, the way it's told in the popular media, that everything which comes from the outside is just a kind of stimulus for a story in which we're good and they're bad. So without going into the nature of the political regime, this is something that Hannah Arendt identified long ago in Origins of Totalitarianism as a feature of totalitarian society. Which brings me to your point, Ed, about the weaponization of history or information more broadly. Here is, I think, how it works. The way that Russian propaganda dissects the present is to say it is all incoherent. It's impossible to understand. MH17 blows up over Ukraine. Who knows who did it? You know, maybe it was Elvis, maybe it was Martians, maybe it was the CIA. Who knows who did it? And by the time you get to the end of this sort of horrifying postmodern pluralism, you've forgotten about a very real crime, which was almost certainly carried out by a group of people one could identify. The point of Russian propaganda is not to tell any particular story. The point of Russian propaganda in the present is to make the entire world incoherent for you. So at the end of the day, you say, well, who knows, and no one could really know, and there's no such thing as knowledge anyway, right? So they make the present incoherent, but simultaneously, they make the past hypercoherent. They make the past hypercoherent. In the past, Russia was always right, and everyone else was always wrong. That's a hypercoherent story. And when you combine those two things, you can't know anything about the present, but the past 1,000 years tells us that Russia was always right and a victim, and the West was always wrong in trying to hurt Russia. Then that combination allows you to say, well, we don't know anything about the present, but the past tells us that Russia was always a victim. So Russia must be a victim today, and therefore whatever Russia is doing is justified. So the combination of trying to destroy the present and then make the past into a super coherent story has a certain purpose and a certain logic, and it has been to some extent effective.
Wow, you've given me a new word, either super coherent or hyper coherent. That's really good. We could have gone on all afternoon, all evening, probably all night, or even all week. This has been a fantastic discussion, and I'm very grateful to both our panelists for their thoughts. And please join me in thanking them most warmly for those. Thanks. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed it. I have to go to the airport now.
Okay. So glad you